what I will tell you, I mean, the JonBenet Ramsey case, like everyone else, I followed it since it happened. I don't say like everyone else, but like many people. And um, so back in, I mean, it was before I was a profiler, but I was taking a forensic linguistic class with the FBI's behavioral analysis units. They just bring in FBI agents and they, teach you about a little bit about statement analysis and linguistics. And one of the exercises we did was to take a look at the JonBenet Ramsey note.
Ooh, the ransom
And
note.
yeah, so I really enjoyed that exercise quite a bit. And I don't consider myself an expert in statement analysis, but I have had opportunity to look at statements. And sometimes we would work a lot with what we would call our threat assessment unit, who are the experts in statement analysis. And I've learned a lot from them as well. And that was part of the group of people that were teaching us. And I remember sort of being in the minority, I think, in my thoughts on the note. um, so I've always just had an interest in it. And then my one of my colleagues, Bob Drew, and I covered just the note on our show. We didn't go into the whole investigation. I just wanted to and the great thing about Bob, kind of much like you, he doesn't follow cases like I do. He does not have like this true crime background. How he became a profile, he was a police officer and then, became an FBI agent and then he became a profiler and really just knows the cases he worked and isn't somebody who follows true crime. And he actually knew very little about the JonBenet Ramsey murder case. So I thought it would be a really good person to analyze the note with me. And so what we did and I'm explaining what we didn't do and what we did. We didn't go back over the note in your typical statement analysis to try to say why it's not a ransom note, like the use of pronouns and the vagueness and we didn't do that. That's been done a million times. What I really wanted to do, because we know it's not a ransom note, right? What I really wanted to do was just kind of look at it like just within the four corners of the pages. And can we glean the personality traits and characteristics, true personality traits and characteristics of its author without any kind of confirmation bias of, and obviously we're reading the note. And I think probably the only thing that we considered while reading the note is that JonBenet was found dead and that she had been sexually assaulted. That's a consideration, but everything else just block out. We don't know anything about the family or anything like that. Um, at least, we try not to. So in looking at it, I think probably the place I always start is you read the note. What's the one thing we know about the author of this note? What is one thing we can come up with about this author that we know is absolutely a certainty? And for me, that is that the author has watched certain movies and committed, not to complete memory, but committed partial memory to lines of these movies. So that has always stood out to me as it has to many other people. And that the author has, taken on the lines of these, you know, these bigger than life horrible murderers, whether they're serial killers or terrorists or madmen. These are the words that they've sort of internalized and now are putting down into writing. So that's the place that I start with. And so, an avid movie watcher and of these particular types of movies, because of course back then, you're not Googling things and you don't have access to that. So this is probably something they already had, in their minds, or it was something they already had in their mind. And then the rest of it was just really just what we started to take out of it, the tone of the note, and it was sarcastic. It was condescending toward John Ramsey. Certainly the focus was John Ramsey. JonBenet's name isn't even mentioned. this is all about kind of focus toward John. In fact, the family, I think, is mentioned once. So it sort of gave us an idea of potentially what the offender feels their relationship is to John Ramsey. And certainly that person felt like potentially inferior to John Ramsey or subordinate of John Ramsey. And I don't necessarily mean that in a work sense that this is John Ramsey, John Ramsey was this person's boss, but there's this kind of inferiority to John Ramsey and a resentment of John Ramsey, despite maybe complimenting him at the beginning. Toward the end, it's just all becomes quite hateful toward him, quite condescending, and it's definitely degrading to John Ramsey. And it's sadistic. It's sadistic what the killer describes would happen to their daughter, and it's a way to, torture John Ramsey. So that was our assessment of the note, with it kind of blocking out everything else. And that whether, and when I say that this is what we've come up with, but we're not identifying an author, and we're certainly not doing handwriting analysis to say this person wrote it, and it's not statement analysis in its traditional way. This is a behavioral analysis of this note. And those were the characteristics that we drew from the reading of that note, and not taking into consideration other things. And it isn't unusual for kind of going back to the crime scene, and there's a lot, obviously we can't rely upon the crime scene because things, once it was starting to be documented, things were not in their original positions anymore. So we don't know what's true or not true, but what we do know is that John Benet Ramsey was sexually assaulted. And some people will consider that staging. It's not staging. She was sexually assaulted. I mean, she was strangled. It's a sexually motivated homicide. And when we see sexually motivated homicides, and it's very sadistic. And we see similar characteristics in her homicide, a sadistic, sexually motivated homicide, and a letter that comes across very sadistic. So we determine that the killer likely wrote the letter, and because those similarities. And it's not unusual for us to see sadistic killers who continue to communicate with family members. And it's a way to kind of draw out their experience. It's a way to continue to, engage in their sadistic fantasies. We saw Long Island serial killer communicated with victims' family members. Yeah. Unnecessary. He's committed this crime, but he had this need to continue to fulfill his sadistic fantasies. And it's a continuation of that. And Israel Keyes did the same thing. It's my belief, whether he was going to get money or not, he was absolutely torturing that family for his own sadistic pleasure. And so it's not unheard of to, have these killers continue with communicating.
That's an interesting point. So I wonder if John has received any communications, and if he hasn't, that might make him look more suspicious. I don't know.
Right. I mean, I'm not aware that he's ever received any additional communications or anything like that. I mean, obviously I'm not tied into the investigation. I pretty much know. I mean, I think I know, there's a lot of information out there, but I'm sure there's a lot of investigative information we're not privy to.
It's so contradicting. So one thing that made me think someone in the family was aware of it was because the word for sexual assault, they said either chronic or historical sexual assault. So I'm making me think that it happened more than once. But with this case, if you look up one thing and then you'll find something else that says, nope, that was never said. Or was there footprints in the snow? No, there wasn't footprints in the snow. Or was it this way? Or it's like there's not one clear truth to this. So
there isn't, but there is. I think there is evidence to suggest that, when the medical professionals, several medical professionals, they tended to believe that this was chronic versus acute, but chronic might not mean, years. It might mean days, or, and there wasn't, it's not clear if this is related to perhaps an infection or wiping, or so it's not completely clear. But one thing that I would say is that based on what happened to her and based on the note, you are dealing with someone who is sadistic and likely has done this type of thing before. And, there's always the one off, as we talked about. Like I said, I wouldn't be
Case
surprised if
by
they never
case.
did anything before. But, um, you know, th- this was something that, their sadistic personality will be evident in their interactions with other people. And it doesn't necessarily mean they had to have committed murder,
Right.
but we talk about this on our episode about what kinds of things we'd be looking for in the person. You're just seeing things outside of sexual murder. This part of their personality is going to bleed over into their everyday life and their interactions with people, and people that come into contact with this person might be left surprised by how they were treated by this person, or the fact that this person, the one thing we think about this person, they tend to harbor resentment and a grudge. And perhaps, they took revenge on somebody and the person doesn't even realize what they had done. Things like that. So that was our assessment of, looking at the note in a behavioral perspective. And we are very well aware that that may not line up with maybe the prevailing theories, but we have to stick to to what we believe, and not just go along with the theories. Or what I really try to do is not engage in confirmation bias.
Yeah, yeah.
So, and that can be very difficult. But I completely understand the other interpretations of the note as well.
So I'm hearing intruder. Is that what that's what people probably want to know? And you could say 50-50,
Yeah.
or
No,
intruder is
I don't want to say 50-50. I think that our interpretation looking at that note leads us to believe it likely is an intruder, and not a member of the immediate family right in the house that night. Yeah, and that is being said without truly knowing John or Patsy Ramsey. I've never seen anything really come out about either of them that would indicate they would have these type of sadistic tendencies, or there's really any history of severe abuse. Or it's a matter of interpretation to some people. But um, those are, you do have to take the characteristics and kind of put them over suspects. And I don't know enough about either one of them to say, oh, they can 100% be ruled out. Nothing that I've ever read makes me think it's either one of them. There's nothing that's like, oh, oh, that's a
sadistic
sign.
behavior.
Yeah, that's really sadistic behavior, or that's, a pattern or something that I would recognize in the note or the author. I mean, to me, I read that note. I do not. I mean, I know some people, in some of my comments and some of my listeners said, basically, it's Patsy. How can you not see that?
Yeah, they're
And
biased. Yeah.
yeah, well, maybe I'm biased too in my own way. But when I read that note, I do not see the author as Patsy Ramsey. That does not, I don't see that. In fact, reading that leads me away from Patsy Ramsey. Um, as writing it, and unless you are going to tell me that these are the dynamics of the relationship between Patsy and John, and that Patsy watched these movies and committed these movies to memory and things like that. If you're going to tell me that about her, then I would be like, okay, maybe. But I don't know those things about her. So there's certainly animosity toward John in the note. And um so I have to think that this might be a dual motivation, of, I mean, I think I heard someone say, well, another profiler say, I've never seen a sexual murder committed for revenge. And I don't think that that's that we think. It's a sexually motivated homicide. But the person, used, extended their enjoyment of this by further torturing John Ramsey. And likely because they didn't like John Ramsey, and it's clear they have knowledge of him in some capacity. My colleague Bob thinks it's really very much in a business capacity.
Because that
But
exact dollar amount, right, of the bonus that was written in there seemed pretty interesting.
yeah, that is very interesting. And we thought that was a direct message to him. This is about you. Another reference to him. So, um, you know, um, but while I don't think the sexual homicide was committed just to get back at John, certainly that letter was to, you know, to continue to hurt John and the family, making him think he can save the day and save his child, only that he's gonna
But it was
find
too
that
late.
yeah. So, that's our interpretation. And like I said, I know there are other interpretations, and I understand why people base that. I do understand it. That's just not how I interpret it.
Yeah, it's so hard to know what the truth is. Where I just got frustrated. I'm like, I can't even look at this because you hear one thing and then there's another side of it. So I think the
Yeah.
only thing worse than no information is bad information. It's going to lead you
And
down the
that's
wrong
the
path.
problem. And that's why we really wanted to just stick with the letter, because we know that's evidence from the crime. We absolutely know that, and we know what happened to her. So those are the kind of the two things that we know. We don't know anything else. We don't, there's so many interpretations of their behavior and of like how they were acting. And but then there's the other side of saying that didn't happen at all. Well, if that happened, why wasn't that in the report? So there's just so much, and you have to just kind of block all that out, because as you start forming a theory, then everything that you're looking at you're looking at through the lens to fit
Right.
that theory.
Bias
That's
yourself.
exactly confirmation bias. And I think that that's what started to happen. And I think that happens with a lot of cases. And so you really have to block it out. But what is true crime thing? True crime
They're
garage.
with you.
They are. Oh,
Yeah.
good.
Mhm. So that means
So like, oh, you're
well,
you're with the family.
I'm just
I
like,
mean, I
when I don't,
understand.
when I don't
It,
know evidence, then I fall to statistics. So I'm like, all right, it happened
yeah.
in their house. It's likely. And I know some of that data is skewed because that's all like the infant deaths and everything when kids are, extremely young, even, from like infant to 3 is the biggest, like
Hmm.
newborn to 3 years old. That's the most of the deaths. And then even 5, the next range is, like 3 to 7. But I don't know. I rely on statistics. So I'm like, since I can't find what the truth is, and I'm not looking at the case, I'm like, I don't know, then I'm going to roll the dice and what's the data show me?
Yeah. And I think that is perfectly valid. I mean, I explained that earlier in this conversation that we're having about statistics. If there's no evidence that points me in one way, one direction, you kind of default back to statistics. And so I think that's perfectly valid. And that is a great point. I mean, people have made a lot of great points as to why that this, John Bonet was not killed by an intruder and was killed by her parents. I can't, you know, yeah,
And my
I
initial
don't know
reaction, like,
enough.
yeah, how
Yeah.
could you do that to your own kid? So that was my first thing. That's my emotional part. How can anyone do this to their own child? And I'm like, all right, take the emotion out. Let's look at what I can. And there's circumstantial things that are interesting. Why they both get lawyers right away. I'm like, well, did that happen or didn't that happen? So you just get lost in what actually
Yeah.
happened.
It
And
depends on who is telling the story
right,
about the way the lawyers came into the picture. And both versions are probably biased. So you can't necessarily, but I'll tell you that I and all my colleagues would tell any family member, get an attorney right away. Like,
yeah,
I mean, even if you don't have anything to hide, I mean, that's just kind of, um, you know, that's good advice. Make sure you're
right.
protected.
But
But
it's two
that can
separate
also,
attorneys. Weird.
um,
But
I don't think so
okay.
necessarily. Not, you have to remember they're operating they were operating at a very different level of
Yeah. Money.
financial and
Yeah.
business savvy. I mean, they are way up there. So it's,
Yeah. That's
wouldn't be
true.
unusual that the two different people would have two different attorneys, but also, in terms of their interests. I mean, you know, I think they had to have two separate attorneys, because if one of them did it, the other one has to protect their own interests. And the attorney, any attorney is going to protect their client.
Yeah. And
And
throw the
so
other person under the bus if need be.
absolutely. So I think you had to make sure that they both had the most fair representation. They had to have two separate attorneys. That would be because they might have different
Mhm.
interests. Yeah, absolutely. So, but everything, again, just kind of becomes, who's telling the story and through what
Yeah.
lens. And, um, you know, I tend to go back to, okay, what was initially seen? What are the initial reports? Um, and just stick with those. And then as time goes on, people's memories,
Yeah. They don't
sometimes
get better.
fade, or
Yeah.
they don't get better. And um, things, you start seeing things maybe different than what they were at the time. Maybe you didn't notice something, so anyway, I just think
Mhm.
you kind of have to just go back to the very basics. Um, but
Yeah. I think that,
there will always be a part of me that will always be tugging at me. Oh yeah, maybe it was one of them. It's completely plausible.
right.
Um, but again, going back to the murder itself, it's very sadistic. You would expect to see that type of person, that nature come out in other interactions in their life. It's not just going to be limited just to this time. And so, knowing more about the two individuals, and people have talked about them, and some in good terms, some in bad terms, but there's nothing that stood out to me that would be like, yeah,
Mhm.
doing something like that, that makes me think they're capable of this crime. I've never seen that. I mean, I could speculate as like with everyone else, but without any hard evidence.